When Margaret Cole signed the inheritance papers for a monastery she'd never heard of, the lawyer looked at her like she'd just accepted a curse. The building hadn't housed monks in 43 years, its stone walls crumbling into the mountain soil of rural Pennsylvania, its grounds overgrown with thorns thick enough to draw blood. But Margaret wasn't inheriting potential. She was inheriting a roof for herself and her 7-year-old daughter, Emma, because their shelter beds had run out and winter was coming to the Appalachian foothills with the kind of cold that didn't forgive mistakes. Sometimes rock bottom looks like salvation if you're desperate enough to squint. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret stood in the broken gravel drive of St. Benedict's Monastery on a gray October afternoon, her daughter's hand tight in hers, both of them staring at the structure that would become their home. The building rose before them like a forgotten prayer, 3 stories of weathered limestone and collapsed slate roofing, surrounded by 20 acres of wild meadow that hadn't seen a plow in decades. A rusted iron cross still crowned the chapel spire, tilted at an angle that suggested even God had given up on the place. The name meant nothing to Margaret. Just another piece of discarded history in a county full of them. Emma's small hand squeezed hers. "It looks scary, Mom." Margaret couldn't argue. Even from outside, the monastery carried the weight of abandonment. Not fresh decay, but something older and more pervasive. The scent of mold and wet stone that had soaked into mortar and refused to leave even after 4 decades of emptiness. That made it perfect. No one else would want it, which meant no one would compete for it, which meant Margaret could actually keep it. The math was simple enough. A crumbling monastery versus sleeping in her car at rest stops while trying to hide Emma from child services. The monastery had walls and mostly intact sections. That made it a palace compared to the alternative. "Old doesn't mean bad," Margaret said, injecting confidence into her voice that she didn't remotely feel. "It just means sturdy. They built these places to last forever. We can make it work." Emma looked up at her with eyes that carried too much understanding for 7 years old. She'd developed that look over the past 14 months since her father David had died from the overdose. Sudden, violent, final. No time for goodbyes or explanations. Just Margaret holding Emma at a memorial service she couldn't afford while trying to figure out how to be enough for both of them. The lawyer had given Margaret a single key, heavy iron worn smooth by countless hands over more than a century. It felt like an anchor in her palm as she approached the main entrance, a massive oak door designed to keep the sacred in and the world out. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the space beyond. The interior hit them like a physical weight. Dust thick enough to choke on. Cold that seeped through their jackets immediately. And beneath it all, that persistent smell of abandonment and old incense, prayers that had tried and failed to keep the building's soul alive. What dim light filtered through broken stained glass windows revealed a vast chapel space filled with overturned pews, collapsed sections of ceiling, and debris that spoke of decades without human care. The nave stretched before them, ceiling lost in shadows 30 feet above. Stone stairs led to upper floors where monastery cells had once housed monks in their daily devotions, their doors hanging open to reveal rooms filled with forgotten furniture and years of accumulated ruin. "Can we really live here?" Emma asked quietly, her voice small in that enormous space. Margaret surveyed their new home with what she hoped resembled optimism. "We'll make it work. See those rooms upstairs? We'll find the best one. Clean it out real good. Set up our beds. I can get a generator working. Maybe even find a wood stove for heat. It'll be an adventure." "I don't want adventures anymore," Emma said softly. The words struck Margaret harder than the girl probably intended. Emma used to love adventures. Before David died, before Margaret's nursing assistant job disappeared when the clinic closed, before their life became a series of increasingly desperate compromises, Emma had been fearless. She'd explored construction sites with Margaret, built elaborate forts from cardboard, invented games that could occupy her for hours. Now she flinched at change, clung to routine, looked at the world through eyes that expected disappointment. Margaret knelt to her daughter's level, her knees protesting against the dirty stone floor. "I know things have been hard. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I promise we're going to be okay. This place might not look like much now, but it's ours. Nobody can evict us. Nobody can raise the rent. We just need to make it livable." Emma studied her face with that too perceptive gaze. "You promise?" Margaret had learned the weight that promises to children carried. Promises you might not be able to keep. "I promise we'll try our hardest. That's all I've got." Emma seemed to accept it, nodding slightly before turning her attention back to exploring their strange new home. They spent the remaining daylight hours doing basic reconnaissance. Margaret tested light switches, finding to her disappointment that no electricity functioned at all. The wiring had been stripped or destroyed decades ago. The plumbing proved equally complicated. She found old bathroom facilities near what had been the monks' dormitory, but the pipes were frozen solid, probably burst in multiple places. No running water meant hauling it from somewhere, a problem she'd need to solve before the first snowfall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The upper floors revealed monastery cells, a communal dining hall with long wooden tables rotted through in places, and storage areas packed with boxes of old religious texts and supplies. Margaret made mental notes of what could be salvaged. Some candles, basic tools, even a few blankets that might work once washed and aired out. As the sun began its descent toward the mountain ridge, Margaret started hauling their possessions from her battered Honda. They didn't have much. 3 duffel bags of clothes, a box of Emma's stuffed animals and books, Margaret's nursing supplies that she still carried out of habit, sleeping bags and blankets, a camp stove, and a cooler with what food they'd managed to keep. For trips to get everything inside, each one emphasizing just how little they'd accumulated in 7 years of Emma's life. She chose what appeared to be the abbot's old quarters on the second floor for their living space. It had windows facing west that would catch the sunset and a door that still closed properly, with a fireplace that might actually work if she could clear the chimney. Margaret swept out the worst of the dust and debris, then laid out their sleeping bags on the floor. The camp stove went in one corner, their food supplies in another. Emma arranged her stuffed animals on the window ledge with careful precision, creating order in the chaos. "It's like camping," Margaret offered, watching her daughter sort through her belongings. "Camping is supposed to be temporary," Emma replied without looking up. Margaret had no response to that. Instead, she focused on practical tasks. Heat would be their immediate challenge. The monastery had been built with fireplaces in most rooms, designed for an era before central heating. If she could get the chimneys cleared and find wood, they could survive the winter. For tonight, she had emergency blankets and their sleeping bags layered together. They ate dinner sitting on the floor of their new room. Sandwiches made from supplies Margaret had scraped together from a food bank. Emma chewed slowly, her eyes wandering around the bare stone walls. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected the single camping lantern providing their light. "Tell me about Dad," Emma said suddenly. The request caught Margaret off guard. Emma rarely asked about David anymore. The first few months after his death, Emma had asked constantly. Where was Dad? Was he in heaven? Did he know they missed him? Margaret had fumbled through explanations that satisfied neither of them, eventually settling on variations of "Dad loved you very much and some things we can't understand." After a while, Emma stopped asking. Margaret had thought that meant acceptance. Now she wondered if it had just been retreat. "What do you want to know?" Margaret asked carefully. Emma picked at her sandwich. "Do you think he would be mad about us living here?" Margaret wrestled with this question. Would David be angry that their daughter was sleeping on the floor of an abandoned monastery? Or would he understand that Margaret was doing everything she could with impossible circumstances? She'd never know. David was gone, and she was left making decisions alone, hoping she wasn't failing their daughter in ways that would mark her forever. "Your dad understood that life doesn't always go the way we plan," Margaret said honestly. He grew up without much himself. His family struggled. He knew what it meant to make hard choices. I think he'd understand we're doing what we have to do to stay together. Emma absorbed this quietly. I just want to feel safe again. The simple statement nearly broke Margaret. Me too, baby. That's what I want, too. They finished dinner in comfortable silence. Margaret cleaned up their minimal dishes while Emma prepared for bed, changing into her pajamas and brushing her teeth with bottled water in the stark bathroom down the hall. When she returned, Margaret tucked her into her sleeping bag and read to her from one of the books they'd brought, a worn copy of The Secret Garden that had been Emma's favorite before everything changed. Emma fell asleep halfway through the chapter, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood rest. Margaret continued reading softly for a few more minutes, reluctant to stop this small piece of normalcy. Finally, she closed the book and simply sat there watching her daughters sleep in their strange new home. The monastery made sounds at night. Stone contracting as temperatures dropped. Wind finding its way through gaps in the structure. Something settling somewhere deep in the building's foundations. Normal sounds for an old religious building, Margaret told herself, even as they raised the hairs on her neck. She'd grown up in suburbs and rental apartments, not sprawling stone monasteries. The sheer size of the place, the echoing spaces below, the shadows that pressed against their small island of light, it all felt overwhelming in the darkness. Margaret checked the camping lantern to make sure it had enough fuel, then settled into her own sleeping bag. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the hard floor beneath her. At some point in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally won. She woke to pale mountain sunlight streaming through the dirty windows and Emma already awake, sitting cross-legged on her sleeping bag and drawing in her sketchbook. Margaret had bought her that sketchbook and a set of colored pencils 6 months ago, back when she'd still had part-time work at a diner. Emma had filled half of it already with elaborate drawings of flowers and buildings, detailed sketches that showed surprising talent for a 7-year-old. "Morning, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice rough from sleep in the dry air. "Morning," Emma replied without looking up from her drawing. "The building makes weird sounds at night. Old places do that. It's just the stone settling. Temperature changes. Nothing to worry about." Emma nodded, but didn't look convinced. Margaret couldn't blame her. In daylight, the monastery looked less menacing but no more welcoming. Just old, vast, and fundamentally empty. Margaret made them a basic breakfast on the camping stove. Instant oatmeal and instant coffee for herself. As they ate, she outlined her plan for the day. First priority was finding a water source and getting at least one fireplace functioning. If she could manage that, they'd have drinking water and heat, the basics for survival. "Can I explore while you work?" Emma asked. Margaret hesitated. The monastery was large, potentially dangerous with its collapsed sections and questionable structural integrity. But keeping Emma confined to one room seemed cruel, and she couldn't watch her constantly while trying to assess the building's systems. "You can explore this floor," Margaret compromised. "But you stay away from any collapsed areas and you stay where I can hear you if you call. Deal?" "Deal," Emma agreed readily. They spent the morning on parallel tasks. Margaret descended to explore the monastery's lower levels, dark spaces accessed by stone staircases that felt dangerously worn under her feet. She found what appeared to be old storage cellars, their vaulted ceilings still intact, their walls lined with empty shelving. One room contained the remnants of what might have been a wine cellar, broken bottles scattered across the floor. Another held old furniture too damaged to salvage. Meanwhile, Emma's footsteps echoed overhead as she wandered the second floor. Occasionally, she'd call down to Margaret, reporting her discoveries. A chapel library with books falling apart from moisture. A room with old vestments hanging in a wardrobe. A dining hall with benches carved with monks' initials. Margaret was examining what appeared to be an old root cellar, trying to determine if it could be used for food storage, when Emma's voice cut through the building with unusual urgency. "Mom! Mom, come quick. Margaret was up those stairs faster than she thought possible, heart hammering. Emma's tone hadn't been panicked exactly, but something close. She found her daughter standing at the far end of the second-floor corridor in front of what appeared to be a solid stone wall, right where the hallway seemed to dead end. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked, scanning for danger. "Nothing's wrong," Emma said, her eyes bright with excitement. "But look at this." She pressed her small hand against what appeared to be solid stone, and a section of the wall swung inward with a soft mechanical click, revealing a heavy wooden door beneath. A door Margaret would have sworn wasn't there moments before. "It's a hidden door," Emma whispered. "I was leaning against the wall and felt something move under my hand. There's a button." Margaret approached cautiously, examining the mechanism. The false stone panel was cleverly designed to seem like solid wall when closed, operated by a hidden switch disguised as a loose stone. Beyond the wooden door, darkness suggested a space larger than a simple storage closet. "Stay here," Margaret instructed Emma. She pulled out her phone, activating its flashlight function, and pulled the wooden door open fully. Cold air rushed out, impossibly cold given the building's overall temperature. Stone steps led downward, worn smooth by centuries of use. The stairs descended into darkness, disappearing beyond her phone's light. But what commanded Margaret's attention was what hung on the wall just inside the doorway. A large painting in a protective frame, somehow preserved despite the cold and damp. The image showed a stern-looking monk in traditional robes, his hand resting on an ornate Bible, his expression carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Beneath the painting, a brass plate bore an inscription. Margaret had to step closer to read through the grime. Father Benedict Thorn. Founded St. Benedict's Monastery 1847. Guardian of Sacred Trust. "What is it?" Emma called from the doorway, unable to contain her curiosity. "It's hidden stairs," Margaret said slowly. "I think they lead to catacombs. Old monasteries sometimes had them for burials or storage." Emma slipped past her despite her earlier instruction to stay put, her eyes huge as she took in the descending passage. Why would someone hide stairs to a basement? It was an excellent question. Margaret had no answer. She moved carefully down the stone steps, Emma following close behind despite Margaret's better judgment. The stairs descended about 20 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Margaret's phone light swept across the space, and her breath caught in her throat. The catacombs were vast. Not a single room, but a network of chambers carved from the living rock beneath the monastery. And stacked along every wall, filling alcoves and niches, arranged on stone shelves with reverent care, were religious artifacts. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Margaret stepped into the nearest chamber, her light revealing treasures that shouldn't exist in an abandoned building. Gold chalices encrusted with jewels. Silver reliquaries containing fragments of what might be saints' bones. Illuminated manuscripts in glass cases, their pages glowing with colors that seemed impossible after centuries. Carved ivory crucifixes. Paintings of saints in gilded frames. Vestments embroidered with gold thread and precious stones. Emma pressed against her side, both of them frozen in wonder and confusion. "Mom," Emma whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "Is this treasure?" Margaret stared at the artifacts gleaming dully in her phone's light. Real treasure, probably worth millions of dollars, maybe tens of millions. Hidden in catacombs beneath a monastery she'd inherited from a great-aunt she'd never met. An aunt whose lawyer's letter had simply said, "Final wishes dictate the monastery passes to you." No other explanation was provided. "Yes," Margaret heard herself say from very far away. "I think it is." Margaret spent the next 6 hours locked in those catacombs while Emma sat at the top of the stairs, entertaining herself with her sketchbook. The cold bit through Margaret's jacket, numbed her fingers, made her breath fog in the air, but she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until she understood what Father Benedict Thorn had left behind. The catacombs contained more than artifacts. Tucked in an alcove near what appeared to be the main burial chamber, Margaret found a leather-bound ledger, its pages stiff with cold but remarkably preserved by the underground temperatures. She carried it up to warmer air, waiting for it to thaw enough to open without damaging the brittle paper. While she waited, Margaret tried to catalog what she'd seen. The artifacts weren't random collections. They were organized with careful intention. One chamber held chalices and liturgical vessels. Another contained manuscripts and religious texts. A third housed reliquaries and saints' bones. A fourth was filled with paintings and sculptures. Each item had been placed with reverence, protected from the world above. At current valuations, even accounting for the murky legalities of religious artifact sales, Margaret was looking at something north of $400 million. Maybe closer to $500 million if the manuscripts were as old as they appeared and if the relics could be authenticated. It was more money than Margaret had earned in her entire life. More money than she could conceptualize. Enough to give Emma everything David's death had stolen from her. A real home, good schools, college fully funded, security against every disaster that might come. Everything a mother could want for her daughter. But the ledger, when it finally thought enough to read, complicated everything. The first page contained a single line written in precise, old-fashioned script. For whoever inherits what the world abandoned, you have earned the right to understand what they never deserved to know. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned to the next page, where detailed entries began. Not inventory records, but something more personal. A confession of sorts, written by a man who clearly trusted no one. Father Benedict Thorn's entries spanned from 1847 to 1889, documenting not just what he'd hidden, but why. The monk had lived through the anti-Catholic riots of the 1840s and the know-nothing violence that swept Pennsylvania. He'd watched churches burned, priests murdered, sacred objects stolen and melted down for their gold. So he'd created his own security, systematically hiding the most valuable religious artifacts sent to St. Benedict's for safekeeping, storing them where violent mobs could never find them. The ledger described not one chamber, but 6 separate sections of the catacombs. Artifacts divided and hidden with the careful paranoia of a man who'd seen civilization turn savage overnight. But it was the final entry, dated 3 weeks before Father Benedict's death in 1889, that made Margaret's chest tighten. The order believes these treasures belong to Rome, to be displayed in distant cathedrals where wealthy patrons can admire them while the faithful starve. The diocese demands I surrender what was entrusted to me, to be sold for their ambitions rather than preserved for their purpose. I have made arrangements. Let time separate the faithful from the opportunists. Let silence protect what violence sought to destroy. Whoever inherits this monastery through honest means, may they prove worthier than those who claim authority through titles alone. Margaret read those words 3 times, trying to parse the bitterness. A monk defying his own church hierarchy, hiding sacred treasures not from outsiders but from his own religious superiors. Father Benedict had left the monastery to his order and his will, but the wealth that actually mattered, he'd hidden with instructions only discoverable by someone who actually occupied the property long enough to stumble upon its secrets. The order had clearly operated the monastery for another 60 years before abandoning it in the early 1950s. 60 years of monks living above a fortune they never discovered, following their daily prayers while millions of dollars in sacred art sat beneath their feet. And now that inheritance belonged to Margaret Cole, a 31-year-old former nursing assistant who'd inherited the property because she was the last living relative of someone she'd never met, not because she deserved anything. Margaret emerged from her research to find Emma had drawn an elaborate picture of the hidden door, complete with mysterious shadows and glowing treasures. The girl looked up as her mother appeared, her expression curious but patient. "Did you find more treasure?" Emma asked. "Maybe," Margaret said. "I found some very old information. I need to check a few things to know if it means anything. Can I help?" Margaret considered this. She'd need to locate the other 5 chambers Father Benedict had mentioned. Some of that exploration Emma could participate in safely. And honestly, the idea of having company while she pursued what might be an elaborate dead man's riddle appealed to her. "Yeah," Margaret said. "You can help." They drove into Millbrook, the nearest town of any size, with the ledger locked in Margaret's glove compartment. The town consisted of one main street lined with businesses that had seen better days. A hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, a church called Sacred Heart that probably served as the community's spiritual center. Margaret parked outside the hardware store, a place called Brennan's that looked like it had been there since Father Benedict's time. The interior smelled of sawdust, metal, and motor oil. An older woman stood behind the counter, her weathered face and capable hands marking her as someone who'd done more than just sell supplies over her lifetime. "Help you find something?" the woman asked. Margaret had prepared a mental list. Flashlights, work gloves, a pry bar in case any of the other chambers had stuck doors or sealed entrances. Need some exploration supplies. Good flashlights, work gloves, and a pry bar. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "You the one who inherited the old monastery?" News traveled fast in small towns. Margaret shouldn't have been surprised. "That's me. Margaret Cole." "Patricia Brennan," the woman said, extending a calloused hand. "My grandmother worked as a cook at that monastery back in the 20s and 30s. Said it was a strange place. Beautiful in its way, but the monks kept to themselves. Father Benedict's ghost supposedly still walks those halls." Margaret felt a strange connection to the stern face in that painting. What happened to the monastery? Why'd they abandon it? Patricia's expression clouded. "The order ran out of money, that's what happened. After the war, fewer men were joining religious life. The building needed expensive repairs they couldn't afford. By the 50s, there were only 3 monks left, all elderly. When the last one died in 53, the diocese just closed it up. Been sitting empty ever since, passing through various owners who couldn't figure out what to do with it." The story aligned with what Margaret had read in Father Benedict's ledger. A legacy abandoned by the institution that should have preserved it. "Well," Margaret said, "I'm hoping to make something of the property. At least make it livable. Starting with basic exploration and cleanup." Patricia studied her with an assessing gaze. "What exactly are you planning to explore?" Margaret had anticipated this question. Previous owners must have left equipment and supplies scattered around. Old furniture, maybe historical items worth preserving. Figured I'd see what's there before I start renovations. Patricia nodded slowly, accepting this explanation. "Flashlights are on that wall. Industrial ones'll run you about 40 each. Gloves and pry bars over here." The total came to $267, money Margaret barely had. As Patricia rang up the purchase, she said casually, "You know, there's been stories about that monastery for years. Folks say Father Benedict had church treasures all over the property before he died. Urban legend type stuff, but the stories persist." Margaret kept her expression neutral. "People say that about a lot of old places." "Usually," Patricia agreed, "but Father Benedict wasn't like most monks. Man survived anti-Catholic violence by being smarter and more careful than everyone around him. Wouldn't surprise me if the stories had some truth." Margaret loaded her purchases into her car, hyper-aware of the ledger in her glove compartment. If rumors about hidden treasures already existed, she'd need to be extremely careful. The last thing she needed was treasure hunters or curious locals taking interest in her activities. Back at the monastery, Margaret spread Father Benedict's hand-drawn maps across a table in what had been the abbot's study, comparing them to the current building layout. The second chamber was supposedly located beneath what the ledger called the eastern cloister. Margaret had noticed a collapsed section of covered walkway on the building's eastern side, probably the foundation of what had been that cloister. The map indicated the chamber entrance was hidden beneath the 7th flagstone from the cloister's northeastern corner, accessible through a mechanism Father Benedict described in elaborate detail. She and Emma walked the property as afternoon shadows stretched long across the wild meadow. The eastern cloister area sat overgrown with blackberry brambles and poison ivy, its stone floor buckled and broken in places. Margaret marked the spot the measurements indicated, then began the careful work of clearing vegetation and probing for the hidden mechanism. 2 hours of work revealed a flagstone slightly different from its neighbors, darker and more weathered. Margaret worked the pry bar into its edges, leveraging it up with effort that made her back scream and her shoulders ache. Beneath the stone, a void opened into darkness. "Is that another treasure room?" Emma called, leaning over the opening. Margaret applied her flashlight to the space below. Stone steps descended into what appeared to be a vaulted chamber. She could see the edges of what looked like wooden crates and metal chests. "I think so, baby. Stay here while I check it out." She descended carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. The chamber below was smaller than the main catacombs but no less impressive. Wooden crates lined the walls, their contents protected by the cool, dry environment Father Benedict had engineered. Margaret pried open the nearest crate. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had survived over a century, were illuminated manuscripts. Not religious texts, but something rarer. Medieval books of hours, each one a masterpiece of calligraphy and illustration. She opened one carefully, and even in the dim light, the gold leaf and precious pigments seemed to glow. "Mom," Emma's voice drifted down with unusual urgency. "There's someone coming." Margaret scrambled up the steps faster than she thought possible. A black sedan was pulling up the monastery's drive, official-looking and deliberate. A man in clerical attire emerged, followed by a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. Both of them surveyed the property with expressions that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. "Stay behind me," Margaret instructed Emma, moving to intercept their visitors. The priest was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested he smiled rarely and meant it even less. The woman was younger, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that were already cataloging every detail of the monastery's exterior. "Margaret Cole?" the priest asked, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That's me," Margaret said carefully. "Can I help you?" "Father Thomas Warren," he said without offering his hand. "This is Diane Foster, attorney for the Diocese of Harrisburg. We need to discuss the property you've inherited." Margaret's stomach dropped. Diocese. Attorney. They knew something. "I'm not looking to sell." "We're not looking to buy," Diane Foster countered smoothly. "We're here to discuss certain items that may be located on these premises. Items that legally belong to the Catholic Church." Margaret fought to keep her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." Father Warren's eyes narrowed. "Your great-aunt was Evelyn Thorne. She was the last living descendant of Father Benedict Thorne, who founded this monastery. When she died 3 months ago, certain documents came to light. Documents suggesting Father Benedict may have hidden church property on these grounds before his death." "Documents from where?" Margaret challenged. "From the diocesan archives," Diane Foster said, pulling papers from her briefcase. "Letters Father Benedict wrote to his superiors, mentioning his concerns about artifact security. Inventory records from other monasteries showing items sent here that were never recovered. We have reason to believe those items remain on this property." Margaret crossed her arms. "Even if that were true, I inherited this property legally. Anything on it belongs to me." "That's not how church law works," Father Warren said coldly. "Sacred objects belong to the church regardless of where they're found. You may own the building, Miss Cole, but you don't own artifacts that were stolen from the church's custody." "Stolen?" Margaret's voice rose despite her attempt to stay calm. "From what I understand, Father Benedict was protecting those artifacts from being sold off by church officials who cared more about money than preservation." Father Warren's face hardened. "You found them then?" "The catacombs." Margaret realized her mistake too late. She'd revealed knowledge she shouldn't have. "I've explored my property," Margaret said. "What I found or didn't find is none of your business." "Everything on that property is our business," Diane Foster said firmly. "The diocese has retained legal counsel to recover any church artifacts discovered on these premises. We're prepared to file suit if necessary." Emma pressed against Margaret's side, her small hand gripping her mother's coat. The girl's fear was palpable, and it ignited something fierce in Margaret's chest. You abandoned this place 70 years ago, Margaret said, her voice low and hard. You let it rot. You sold it off to whoever would take it without caring what happened to it. And now that someone's actually here, actually trying to make something of it, you show up demanding whatever might have value. We never abandoned our spiritual claim, Father Warren said. The building may have changed hands, but sacred objects remain church property in perpetuity. Then you should have looked for them, Margaret shot back. You had 70 years. Father Benedict's order had 60 years before that. None of you cared enough to search. None of you valued what he protected enough to preserve it. Diane Foster's expression remained professionally neutral. Your emotional attachment to this property doesn't change the legal realities, Miss Cole. The church has superior claim to any religious artifacts found here. We're willing to negotiate a finder's fee, but the items themselves must be returned to diocesan custody. A finder's fee, Margaret repeated bitterly. You mean a bribe to give up what I found on my own property? We mean fair compensation for your time and effort, Diane Foster corrected. $10,000, paid immediately, in exchange for full access to the catacombs and legal transfer of all artifacts. $10,000. Margaret nearly laughed. She was looking at 400 million in artifacts, and they were offering her 10,000. An insult wrapped in legal language. No, Margaret said flatly. Father Warren's expression turned to stone. Then we'll see you in court. The diocese has resources you can't begin to match, Miss Cole. We will win, and you'll receive nothing. Maybe, Margaret said. But you'll have to find me first. She turned, taking Emma's hand and walking back toward the monastery, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. Behind her, she heard Diane Foster's voice, sharp with warning. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Miss Cole. We know where you are. We know what you found. There's nowhere to hide. Margaret didn't respond. She just kept walking, Emma's small hand tight in hers, both of them disappearing into the monastery's shadowed entrance. Inside, with the heavy oak door closed behind them, Emma looked up at her with huge, frightened eyes. Are they going to take our treasure? Our treasure. Emma had claimed ownership with the simple, absolute logic of childhood. But was it theirs? Margaret had inherited the building legally, but did that give her moral right to artifacts Father Benedict had hidden from his own superiors? Did the church's abandonment negate their spiritual claim? Or was she just a desperate woman trying to rationalize keeping wealth she'd stumbled upon by accident? I don't know, baby, Margaret said honestly. But I know we're not giving it up without a fight. That night, Margaret lay awake long after Emma had fallen asleep, her mind churning through impossible choices. Father Benedict had written that whoever inherited the monastery through honest means deserved to understand his secrets. But the church claimed those secrets had never been Benedict's to hide. They argued sacred objects belonged to the institution, not to individual monks who disagreed with institutional decisions. Margaret hadn't earned this discovery through virtue or dedication. She'd stumbled into it through desperation and her daughter's curiosity. Did that make her worthy by Benedict's standards? Or did the church's claim, however cynical and opportunistic it seemed, actually have merit? Maybe, Margaret thought as sleep finally pulled her under, maybe worthiness wasn't something you inherited or discovered. Maybe it was something you fought for, one impossible choice at a time. The answer came 3 days later, when Margaret found Father Benedict's final message. She'd been exploring the deepest section of the catacombs, following the ledger's cryptic directions to a chamber Benedict described as the heart of what I protected. The passage required crawling through a narrow tunnel that opened into a small, domed room. At the room's center stood a stone altar. On the altar lay a single book, smaller than the ledgers, bound in worn leather. Margaret opened it with trembling hands. The pages contained not inventories or maps, but a letter. Written to whoever found this final chamber. If you read these words, you have proven patient and thorough. You have occupied this monastery long enough to discover what decades of institutional neglect could not find. That alone suggests worthiness my superiors never demonstrated. Know this, I did not steal what I hid. I protected it. The artifacts in these chambers were sent to St. Benedict's during times of violence, entrusted to me for safekeeping. When the violence ended, my superiors demanded I surrender them for display in distant cathedrals, for sale to wealthy collectors, for purposes that served institutional ambition rather than spiritual purpose. I refused. These objects are sacred not because of their gold or jewels, but because of the faith they represent. They belong to the faithful, not to the powerful. Use them to serve those who need serving. Sell them to feed the hungry. Transform their wealth into shelter for the homeless, education for the ignorant, healing for the sick. If the Church demands their return for purposes of display and prestige, you will know they have learned nothing. If they demand them for purposes of service and charity, perhaps they have finally understood. The choice is yours. You found what I hid. You inherited what I protected. May you prove wiser than those who came before. Margaret sat in that small domed chamber, reading Benedict's words by flashlight, and finally understood. This wasn't about her worthiness or the Church's legal claims. It was about purpose. What would serve the faith these objects represented? Locked in diocesan archives? Displayed in cathedral museums? Or transformed into something that actually helped people? She thought about Emma sleeping upstairs. About the homeless shelter beds that had run out. About the families like hers, desperate and struggling, trying to survive in a world that offered them nothing but more struggle. Margaret knew what Father Benedict would want her to do. The question was whether she had the courage to do it. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks moving through the monastery like a woman possessed. While Emma attended a local elementary school that agreed to take her mid-year, Margaret documented every artifact in the catacombs with methodical precision. Photographs from every angle, detailed descriptions, condition assessments. She borrowed books from the county library on religious art valuation, spent late nights researching authentication processes, made careful notes about which pieces were most valuable and which served primarily historical purposes. She also contacted lawyers. Not the expensive kind who worked for dioceses, but legal aid attorneys who specialized in property rights and inheritance law. What she learned both encouraged and terrified her. The artifacts were legally hers as contents of inherited property. The Church could sue, but their claim was murky at best. Father Benedict had been acting within his authority as monastery guardian when he hid the items. The subsequent abandonment of the property by the Church suggested they'd relinquished any claims to contents. But legal right and practical reality were different things. The diocese had resources to tie her up in court for years, resources to make her life miserable even if they couldn't win outright. They could drag out litigation until she ran out of money for attorneys, then force a settlement that gave them everything. Margaret needed a different approach. On a cold November morning, she drove to Philadelphia with Emma, the ledger and her documentation locked in a briefcase borrowed from the legal aid office. They found the building she was looking for near Rittenhouse Square, an elegant brownstone with a discreet bronze plaque. Sotheby's. The auction house representative who met with her was a woman named Claire Ashford, mid-50s with elegant gray hair and eyes that had probably seen every variety of art fraud and desperate seller. Margaret had called ahead, mentioned she had religious artifacts that needed evaluation, but given no details. Claire's expression remained professionally neutral as Margaret spread photographs across the conference table. Then her eyes widened. "Where did you acquire these?" Claire asked carefully. "I inherited a monastery," Margaret said. "These were hidden in catacombs beneath it." She slid Father Benedict's ledger across the table. "This documents what's there and why it was hidden." Claire spent 30 minutes examining the documentation, occasionally making soft sounds of astonishment or disbelief. Finally, she looked up at Margaret with an expression that mixed professional excitement and deep concern. "If these are authentic, and I'd need to verify them personally, but if they are, you're looking at one of the most significant collections of religious art discovered in decades. Conservative estimate, 400 million at auction. Possibly more." Margaret had known the number intellectually, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that photographs couldn't. "That's what I thought." Claire studied her carefully. You understand the complications. The Catholic Church will claim these items. They'll argue Father Benedict had no right to hide them, that they remain church property regardless of your inheritance. I understand, Margaret said. That's why I need your help with something specific. Over the next hour, Margaret outlined her plan. Claire listened with increasing interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions, making notes in a leather-bound portfolio. When Margaret finished, Claire sat back in her chair. It's unusual, she said. Possibly unprecedented. But not impossible. Can you make it happen? Margaret asked. Claire's expression turned calculating. It would require careful coordination. Authentication, cataloging, legal documentation, negotiation with multiple parties. It would take months, maybe a year. And it would cost significant fees. How much? For a collection this size? Standard auction house commission would be 12 to 15%. But given the complexity and the special nature of what you're proposing, I'd need 20% plus expenses. Margaret did the math quickly. 20% of 400 million was 80 million. An obscene amount, yet it still left far more than Margaret needed to accomplish what Father Benedict had requested. 20%, Margaret agreed. But I want everything documented. Every dollar accounted for. Complete transparency. Claire extended her hand. You have my word. And Miss Cole, if you don't mind me saying, Father Benedict chose his heir well. The authentication process took 4 months. Claire brought specialists to the monastery, experts in medieval manuscripts, religious relics, liturgical objects, and Renaissance painting. They worked discreetly, arriving in unmarked vehicles, staying in motels an hour away to avoid drawing attention. Each expert confirmed what Margaret already knew. The collection was extraordinary, genuine, and exactly as valuable as initial estimates suggested. During those months, the diocese increased pressure. Father Warren visited twice more, each time with veiled threats and diminishing patience. Legal letters arrived weekly, warning of impending lawsuits, demanding immediate access to the property. Margaret ignored all of it, focused on the work that mattered. Emma adjusted to school with surprising resilience. She made friends, joined the art club, started bringing home drawings of the monastery that showed it not as a tomb but as a magical castle. In the evenings, she'd help Margaret catalog artifacts, carefully copying descriptions into ledgers, treating each object with the reverence Father Benedict would have appreciated. One evening in March, as they worked together in the catacombs, Emma asked quietly, "Are we going to keep all this?" Margaret had been waiting for this question. "No, baby. We're going to do what Father Benedict wanted. Use it to help people. Like us?" "Like us," Margaret confirmed. "And a lot of other families who need help just as much." Spring came to the Pennsylvania mountains with reluctant beauty, snow melting to reveal wild crocuses and hepatica blooming in the monastery's overgrown gardens. Patricia Brennan from the hardware store had become a regular visitor, bringing supplies Margaret needed and accepting payment on installment plans she never officially acknowledged. The older woman's grandmother had worked at the monastery, and Patricia seemed to feel some ancestral obligation to help its new occupant. It was Patricia who first heard the news, bringing it to Margaret on a warm April afternoon when the air smelled of lilacs and fresh earth. "Diocese filed suit," Patricia said without preamble. "It's all over the county courthouse. They're demanding immediate seizure of any religious artifacts found on your property." Margaret had been expecting this. "Let them file." "You can't fight them, Margaret. They'll bury you in legal fees." "I'm not planning to fight them," Margaret said. "I'm planning to make them irrelevant." 2 weeks later, Margaret held a press conference in the monastery's chapel. She'd contacted every major news outlet in Pennsylvania, plus national networks interested in stories about art discoveries. The turnout exceeded expectations. Cameras filled the space where monks had once prayed, reporters crowding between overturned pews, everyone waiting to hear what the homeless woman who'd inherited a monastery had to say. Margaret stood at the altar with Claire Ashford beside her, Emma sitting in the front row with Patricia. She'd rehearsed this speech 100 times, but her hands still trembled as she began. "4 months ago, I inherited this monastery from a great aunt I never knew. In exploring the property, my daughter and I discovered hidden catacombs containing religious artifacts valued at approximately $420 million. These artifacts were hidden in 1847 by Father Benedict Thorn, who founded this monastery and served as its guardian for 42 years. She paused, letting the cameras capture the magnitude of that number. Father Benedict hid these items not from thieves or vandals, but from his own church superiors. He believed they would sell the artifacts for institutional profit rather than preserve them for their spiritual purpose. Before his death, Father Benedict left instructions. The artifacts should serve the faithful, not the powerful. They should provide shelter, food, education, and healing for those who need it most. Margaret pulled out the final letter, holding it up for the cameras. "I intend to honor Father Benedict's wishes. Every artifact in these catacombs will be sold at auction through Sotheby's. The proceeds, minus necessary expenses and taxes, will be placed in a charitable trust called the Benedict Foundation. This foundation will provide housing assistance for homeless families in Pennsylvania, fund free medical clinics in underserved communities, and offer educational scholarships for students who can't afford college." The chapel erupted with questions, reporters shouting over each other. Margaret raised her hand for silence. "The Diocese of Harrisburg has filed suit to seize these artifacts, claiming they remain church property. I believe they're wrong legally and morally. But I'm not interested in fighting them in court. Instead, I'm making them an offer. If the diocese drops their lawsuit, the Benedict Foundation will grant them seats on the foundation's board. They can help direct how the money is spent, ensure it serves genuine charitable purposes. They can be part of the solution Father Benedict envisioned. But if they continue fighting to seize the artifacts for themselves, they'll do so publicly, showing the world exactly what they value." Claire stepped forward, her voice crisp and professional. "The first auction will be held in 6 months. All proceeds will be independently audited and publicly reported. This is an opportunity for sacred art to fulfill its sacred purpose. The Church can choose to participate in that mission, or they can choose to obstruct it. Either way, the mission will proceed." The media coverage was immediate and overwhelming. National networks picked up the story. Social media exploded with debates about church authority, property rights, and the proper use of religious wealth. Public opinion swung heavily in Margaret's favor. A homeless mother trying to help other homeless families versus a wealthy diocese trying to seize valuable artifacts. The optics were terrible for the church. Father Warren appeared on a morning news show, his face tight with barely controlled anger, arguing that sacred objects belong to the church regardless of circumstances. His performance was a disaster. He came across as entitled and grasping, exactly the kind of institutional arrogance Father Benedict had written about. 3 weeks after the press conference, the diocese quietly dropped its lawsuit. Claire called Margaret with the news on a Tuesday evening. "They've agreed to your terms. They'll take advisory positions on the foundation board, no voting power, but they'll participate in directing the charitable work. In exchange, they won't contest the sales or the foundation's structure." Margaret sat in the monastery's chapel, Emma asleep upstairs, and felt something like vindication wash over her. "We did it?" "You did it," Claire corrected. "Father Benedict chose well, and you honored that choice. The first auction is scheduled for September. Start thinking about the foundation's first initiatives." The autumn auction exceeded all projections. Collectors from around the world bid on medieval manuscripts and Renaissance paintings, liturgical vessels, and sacred relics. The final total, after Sotheby's fees and expenses, came to $463 million. Margaret established the Benedict Foundation with Claire's help and guidance from nonprofit attorneys who donated their time. The foundation's first initiative was purchasing and renovating abandoned buildings across Pennsylvania to create transitional housing for homeless families. Not shelters, but actual apartments where families could stay rent-free for up to 2 years while getting back on their feet. The monastery itself became the foundation's headquarters. Margaret hired staff, including Patricia Brennan as operations manager, and began the slow work of transforming Father Benedict's hidden wealth into tangible help for people who needed it most. Emma turned 8 in the foundation's first year. She'd grown confident and happy, no longer the frightened child who'd moved into the monastery 14 months earlier. She'd started telling people her home was a castle, which wasn't far wrong. Margaret had renovated the abbot's quarters into a real apartment, comfortable and warm, with Emma's drawings covering the walls. The catacombs remained largely untouched, preserved as a reminder of Father Benedict's original mission. Margaret left one chamber exactly as they'd found it, including the monk's portrait and his final letter. School groups visited sometimes, learning about the man who'd defied authority to protect what he believed mattered most. Catherine Hartman, the historian who'd written about Augustus Hartman and Margaret's past life in some parallel universe, didn't exist here. But Patricia filled a similar role, documenting the monastery's history and Father Benedict's legacy, conducting oral histories with elderly residents who remembered when monks still lived here. One afternoon in the second year, Patricia interviewed a 96-year-old woman named Helen, whose grandfather had been Father Benedict's closest friend. "My grandfather said Benedict was the most principled man he'd ever known," Helen told them, her voice papery with age but her mind sharp. Stubborn, demanding, completely uncompromising when it came to doing what he believed was right. The church wanted him to be obedient. He chose to be faithful instead. Those aren't always the same thing. Margaret included that quote in the Foundation's annual report, understanding somehow that real legacy existed in those complicated spaces. People could be difficult and still worth honoring. Institutions could be flawed and still serve purposes. Faith could survive even when authority failed to preserve it. 2 years after inheriting the monastery, Margaret stood in what had been the eastern cloister, now converted to the Foundation's community center. Families filled the space, children playing in areas that had been empty and dead when she'd first arrived. One woman approached her, a young mother maybe 25, holding a toddler on her hip. "I wanted to thank you," the woman said. "Your foundation gave us an apartment when we had nowhere else to go. My husband found steady work. We're saving money. In 6 months, we'll move into our own place. You saved us." Margaret felt Emma's hand slip into hers, her daughter watching the interaction with quiet pride. "Father Benedict saved you," Margaret said gently. "I'm just honoring what he started." The years moved across the monastery property like seasons, each leaving its mark in ways both visible and profound. The building that had stood as a monument to abandonment now thrived with purposeful activity. The Foundation's work expanded. Medical clinics in 3 counties. Scholarship programs in 12 school districts. A job training center in the monastery's old scriptorium, where people learned trades that could support families. Emma turned 12 in the 5th year, growing tall and thoughtful in ways that reminded Margaret achingly of David. Her daughter had developed a passion for architecture, spending hours designing improvements to the monastery's structure or sketching theoretical buildings that could serve multiple community purposes. Margaret kept her drawings in a folder in the preserved catacomb chamber, adding them to Father Benedict's legacy. Patricia passed away peacefully in her sleep at 94, having spent her final years documenting every story she could find about the monastery's history. Her grandson took over running the hardware store and volunteered with the Foundation's job training program, teaching basic carpentry and repairs. The circle completing itself in ways no one could have predicted. The diocese's advisory role had evolved into genuine partnership. Father Warren had retired, replaced by a younger priest named Father Michael who actually understood what Margaret was trying to accomplish. He visited quarterly, reviewed the Foundation's work, and occasionally brought volunteers from his parish to help with community programs. On a mild evening in the 6th year, Father Michael found Margaret in the preserved catacomb chamber, standing before Father Benedict's portrait as she sometimes did when big decisions loomed or gratitude needed expressing. "You come here often?" Father Michael asked. "When I need to remember why this matters," Margaret said. "When I need to feel connected to someone who understood that faith means service, not authority." Father Michael studied the portrait with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. The diocese made a terrible mistake trying to seize these artifacts. We should have seen what you saw. What Father Benedict saw. That sacred objects serve God best when they serve God's people. Better late than never, Margaret said without judgment. They stood in silence for a moment, two people from different worlds united by a dead monk's principled stubbornness. Do you ever wonder if you made the right choice? Father Michael asked. You could have kept this well for yourself. Given your daughter every advantage. Instead, you gave it away. I didn't give it away, Margaret corrected gently. I used it the way it was meant to be used. Emma has everything she needs. Security, education, purpose. She's growing up understanding that wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve something larger than yourself. That's worth more than any trust fund. Father Michael nodded slowly. Father Benedict would approve. I hope so, Margaret said. Emma graduated high school with honors in the 8th year, accepted a full scholarship to study architecture at Penn State. She'd deferred enrollment for a year, wanting time to help design the foundation's newest initiative, a community center in Philadelphia that would combine housing, education, and medical services under one roof. I've been thinking about the rendering building, Emma said one evening, spreading sketches across the dinner table in their apartment. The apartment that had started as a bare stone room with sleeping bags on the floor now held comfortable furniture, photographs on the walls, a kitchen where Margaret cooked actual meals instead of heating camp stove oatmeal. We could convert it into a technical school. Small scale, maybe 30 students at a time. Focus on trades. Carpentry, electrical, plumbing. Skills people can actually use. Margaret studied her daughter's detailed plans, recognizing the careful precision that had always defined Emma's approach to the world. That's ambitious. Also expensive. I know, Emma said, but we've got the funding, and more importantly, we've got the mission. Every person we train becomes someone who can support a family, teach others, build things that matter. It wouldn't just be a school. It would be passing on what Father Benedict believed. That work has dignity. That skills matter. That people deserve opportunities to build lives worth living. It was exactly the kind of project Father Benedict would have approved of. Not just distributing wealth, but creating capability. Teaching people to build things that would outlast them. Let's do it, Margaret said. On a clear October morning in the 10th year, Margaret stood in the monastery's chapel for a ceremony marking the foundation's decade of work. Local officials attended, along with families the foundation had helped, volunteers who'd given time and expertise, and staff who'd made the mission their own. Patricia's grandson gave a short speech about Father Benedict and the importance of honoring history by serving the present. Father Michael spoke about redemption and institutional humility, acknowledging the Church's failures while celebrating its partnership in the Foundation's work. Emma, now 19 and home from college for the ceremony, talked about growing up in a place that taught her wealth meant nothing without purpose, that legacy wasn't about blood or inheritance but about choices made when the world stopped being fair. Margaret didn't speak. She stood at the back, watching faces illuminated by light through restored stained glass windows, listening to stories about how the foundation had changed lives. A family that had transitioned from homelessness to homeownership. A woman who'd completed the medical assistant program and now worked at one of the foundation's clinics. A man who'd learned carpentry through the technical school and now taught there himself. These were the real measures of success. Not the millions in the bank or the artifacts sold, but the lives touched, the skills passed on, the community built from abandonment and desperation and one monk's hidden wealth. As the ceremony concluded and people drifted toward the reception, Margaret slipped away to the preserved catacomb chamber. She stood before Father Benedict's portrait in the quiet space, the monk's stern face unchanged after a century and a half. We made it 10 years, Margaret said quietly. Emma's grown, confident, building her own legacy. The monastery's alive. We're helping families find their way. I sold your artifacts and used the money exactly as you asked. To serve the faithful, not the powerful. To provide shelter and healing and education for people who need it most. She paused, feeling the weight of a decade compressed into this moment. I don't know if that makes me worthy by your standards, but it's the best I could do with what you left behind. I hope it's enough. For the first time in 10 years, Margaret felt the conversation was complete. She'd spent a decade trying to honor a dead monk's wishes, trying to transform hidden wealth into visible good, trying to prove herself worthy of an inheritance she'd never expected. But standing here now, she realized Father Benedict's approval didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Margaret had made choices she could live with, built something her daughter could be proud of, honored the past while creating a future. That was enough. She turned to leave the chamber, then paused, looking back at the portrait one final time. Thank you, she said simply. For hiding what you hid. For writing what you wrote. For caring enough about the future to trust it to someone you'd never meet. We honor that trust. Not perfectly, but honestly. Outside, the celebration continued. Emma was laughing with technical school students, explaining something about load-bearing structures with animated gestures. Father Michael was deep in conversation with Foundation staff about expanding the medical clinic network. Patricia's grandson was showing teenagers how the monastery's old machinery had worked, connecting past to present. Margaret stood in the doorway between the preserved chamber and the living space, between what had been lost and what had been found. The monastery hummed around her with life and purpose, every corner holding stories of transformation and second chances. The land had witnessed a century and a half of human drama. Monks praying and dying, institutions failing and abandoning, a homeless woman finding shelter and discovering purpose. The land remembered all of it, held all of it, offered its blank slate to each new generation willing to work. Margaret had been willing. Desperate, yes, but also willing. And in that willingness, she'd found not just survival but meaning. Not just shelter but home. Not just an inheritance but a mission she could shape with her own hands. The Pennsylvania mountains settled into evening, autumn colors blazing across the ridges. Inside the monastery, people continued celebrating a decade of transformation. Outside, the land held its eternal witness, patient and enduring as it had always been. And in a preserved chamber at the building's heart, Father Benedict Thorne's portrait watched over the space he'd designed to hide his treasures. The wealth that had accidentally saved Margaret Cole and given purpose to everyone who'd found their way to this unlikely place. The building had been dead. Now it lived. The legacy had been lost. Now it continued. The land had witnessed failure. Now it witnessed resurrection. Margaret rejoined the celebration, carrying with her the weight of 10 years, the lessons of a stubborn monk, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes desperate inheritance leads to purpose worth building. The monastery stood against the mountain dusk, no longer a monument to abandonment, but a testament to what happens when people care enough to honor the past while building toward the future. Father Benedict's name lived on, not through institutional memory, but through the community that had grown from his hidden wealth and Margaret's impossible choices. And that, Margaret thought as she watched her daughter laugh with friends in the space they'd built together, was exactly the kind of legacy that would remain long after the last artifact was sold and the last story was told. The land remembered everything. And now it had something worth remembering. 15 years slipped past the monastery like water through mountain stone, soaking in slowly, changing everything from the inside out. The building that Margaret Cole had inherited out of desperation had become something no one could have predicted. Not a museum preserving the past, but a living organism that honored history while creating its own. Emma turned 24 in the summer of the 15th year, no longer the frightened 7-year-old who'd discovered hidden catacombs, but a woman who carried herself with the quiet confidence earned through stability and purpose. She'd graduated from Penn State with honors in architecture, but deferred career offers from prestigious firms in New York and Chicago. Not because she couldn't handle the work, but because she wanted time to build something first. Something that mattered in a way glass towers never would. The Benedict Technical Institute had been her vision, and she'd spent 2 years turning that vision into reality. The old rendering building, once empty and crumbling, now housed classrooms and workshops where 70 students at a time learned trades that could support families. Electrical work, plumbing, carpentry, masonry, HVAC repair. Skills the world would always need, taught by instructors who understood what it meant to rebuild your life from nothing. Margaret watched her daughter teach a basic architecture class to first-year students, explaining load distribution and structural integrity with patient clarity. Emma had inherited David's gentle teaching style, though she'd never known him well enough to recognize it. Some things passed through blood regardless of memory. The monastery grounds had transformed beyond recognition. The wild meadow Margaret had first seen 15 years ago now held gardens tended by community volunteers. Vegetable plots where families could grow food. Flower beds maintained by elderly residents who found purpose in coaxing beauty from mountain soil. The old stone walls had been repaired and reinforced, their weathered surfaces bearing witness to a century and a half of human occupation. 23 families lived in the renovated monastery now, all of them in the Foundation's transitional housing program. Apartments carved from what had been dormitory cells and administrative offices, each one a temporary home for people finding their footing again. Margaret had learned their stories the way Father Benedict had probably learned the monks' names. Sarah, whose husband's medical bills had cost them everything, now training to be a dental hygienist. Marcus, a veteran with PTSD who'd lived in his car for 2 years, now teaching welding at the Technical Institute. Teresa and her 3 children, fleeing domestic violence, now safe behind walls that had protected prayers for generations. The Foundation's reach extended far beyond the monastery's boundaries now. Medical clinics in 7 counties. Scholarship programs in 30 school districts. Job training centers in 4 cities. The Benedict Foundation had helped over 12,000 families in 15 years, transforming Father Benedict's hidden wealth into something the old monk would have recognized as sacred. Not gold and jewels locked away, but human dignity restored, one family at a time. Margaret still visited the preserved catacomb chamber regularly, though less frequently than in the early years. The space remained exactly as they'd found it, Father Benedict's portrait watching with that stern, uncompromising expression. She'd added only one thing over the years. A photograph of Emma at 19, standing in the monastery's main hall surrounded by the first graduating class of the Technical Institute. The old monk and the young woman, separated by a century and a half, united by the belief that real wealth meant nothing if it didn't serve something larger than yourself. Catherine Hartman, the historian who documented Augustus Hartman's legacy in some parallel universe, would have understood what Margaret had built here. But this world had its own chroniclers. Patricia Brennan's grandson, now 40 and running both the hardware store and the Foundation's construction training program, had started an oral history project. Recording the stories of every family the Foundation helped, preserving their struggles and triumphs the way Father Benedict had preserved sacred art. One afternoon in late autumn, a woman appeared at the monastery's entrance. Mid-70s, well-dressed, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Margaret was working in the garden when one of the residents found her. "Someone's here asking for you," says her name is Sister and Thorn. Margaret's hands stilled in the soil. Thorn. Father Benedict's surname. She cleaned her hands on her work jeans and went to meet their visitor. Sister Ann stood in the monastery's entrance hall, her eyes moving across the renovated space with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Wonder, perhaps. Or grief for something lost long ago. "Sister Ann," Margaret said. "I'm Margaret Cole." The woman turned, and Margaret saw tears tracking down weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice unsteady. "I've spent 3 months working up the courage to come here. I wasn't sure I could face it." Margaret gestured to a bench near the window. "Would you like to sit?" Sister Ann settled herself carefully, her hands folded in her lap with practiced discipline. "I'm Father Benedict's great-great-granddaughter. My father was the son of Benedict's youngest nephew. I only learned about this place 2 years ago, when my father died and I was going through his papers. He had letters from the 1890s, family correspondence that mentioned Benedict's monastery and the artifacts he'd hidden." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "You came to claim them?" Sister Ann shook her head. "I came to apologize. I'm a nun, Miss Cole. I've spent 47 years in religious life, teaching in parish schools, working with immigrant communities, trying to live the faith Benedict believed in. When I learned what you'd done with his legacy, how you'd honored his final wishes while my church tried to seize everything for itself, I was ashamed. Ashamed of the institution I've served my whole life. Margaret sat beside her, the autumn sunlight streaming through windows that had been broken when she'd first arrived. Your church did drop the lawsuit eventually. Father Michael has been a good partner in the foundation's work. Because you forced their hand, Sister Anne said. You made it impossible for them to be greedy without being exposed as hypocrites. Benedict would have appreciated the strategy. He was always smarter than his superiors gave him credit for. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two women connected by a stubborn monk's principled defiance of authority. I brought something, Sister Anne said finally. She pulled a small leather journal from her bag. My father kept this. It's Benedict's personal diary from 1840 to 1850. His first decade in America. I thought you should have it. You've earned the right to understand him more fully than the rest of us did. Margaret accepted the journal with trembling hands. Thank you. Sister Anne stood slowly, her joints protesting with age. I teach at a Catholic school in Pittsburgh. We serve low-income families, mostly recent immigrants. Many of them struggle with housing, healthcare, basic stability. If the Benedict Foundation ever expands to Pittsburgh, I'd like to help. Not as Benedict's descendant seeking credit, but as someone trying to honor what he actually believed. We're opening a community center there next spring, Margaret said. We could use someone who understands the neighborhood and the families we're trying to serve. Sister Anne's expression brightened with something close to hope. I'd like that very much. After she left, Margaret sat in the entrance hall reading Benedict's early diary. The entries revealed a younger version of the stern monk in the portrait. A man in his late 20s, newly arrived from Ireland, overwhelmed by America's vastness and opportunity, determined to build something that would last. He wrote about homesickness, about missing his family across the ocean, about the brutal work of establishing a monastery in mountain wilderness. But he also wrote about purpose. About believing that faith meant action, not just prayer. About wanting to create a place that would serve people, not just house religious devotion. One entry, dated December 1843, made Margaret's throat tighten. Today we finished the foundation for what will become our chapel. Brother Thomas asked why we're building so large when our community number's only 7. I told him we're not building for ourselves. We're building for everyone who will come after. For generations we'll never meet, who will need what we create. That's what legacy means. Not preserving your name, but creating something that outlasts your lifetime and serves purposes you can't yet imagine. Margaret closed the diary carefully, understanding with crystalline clarity that Father Benedict had known. Known his order would eventually abandon the monastery. Known the church would fail to preserve what he protected. Known that someday, somehow, his legacy would pass to strangers who might or might not understand what he tried to build. He'd planned for all of it. The hidden artifacts, the detailed ledgers, the final letter explaining his purpose. All of it designed to reach across time and find someone willing to honor his actual wishes rather than institutional authority. She'd thought for 15 years that she'd stumbled into this inheritance by accident. Now she understood. There were no accidents. Only purposes fulfilled in ways no one could predict. Emma found her mother sitting in the entrance hall an hour later, the diary open on her lap, tears streaming down her face. Mom? Emma knelt beside her, concern evident. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Margaret said, wiping her eyes. Everything's right. More right than I ever understood. She told Emma about Sister Anne's visit, about the diary, about finally understanding that Father Benedict had built his entire elaborate system of hidden wealth specifically so it would find someone who valued service over authority, community over institution, people over power. He chose us, Margaret said. Across a century and a half, he reached out and chose us. Emma took her mother's hand, both of them sitting in sunlight that streamed through windows and walls Father Benedict had helped build. Then we better make sure we were worth choosing. The monastery held an anniversary celebration in November marking 15 years since Margaret and Emma had first arrived. No formal ceremony this time, just a potluck dinner in the main hall, residents and staff and community members gathering to share food and stories. The long tables where monks had once eaten in silence now rang with laughter and conversation, children running between chairs, elderly volunteers comparing gardening successes. Margaret stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Emma help serve food, talking easily with students and residents. Her daughter had become the person David would have been proud of. Strong, compassionate, committed to building things that mattered. The woman Emma had grown into bore no resemblance to the frightened 7-year-old who'd first walked through these doors, and Margaret counted that transformation as the greatest success of all. Father Michael approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee and offering one to Margaret. 15 years. He said it like a benediction. From one homeless woman and her daughter to this. It's remarkable. It's what Father Benedict wanted, Margaret said. We just had the courage to do it. More than courage, Father Michael said. Vision. Integrity. The willingness to fight the church itself when we were wrong. He paused. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. How often institutions lose their way because no one has the courage to tell them they're wrong. You did more than honor Benedict's wishes. You reminded us what we're supposed to be. Margaret sipped her coffee, watching the celebration. Do you think he'd approve of all this? Father Michael studied the gathering with contemplative eyes. The noise and chaos, families eating together, children playing where monks once maintained silence. I think he'd recognize it. Maybe not the specific form, but the spirit. This is what he meant by serving the faithful. Not preserving objects in museums, but transforming wealth into human dignity. He'd approve completely. As evening fell and the celebration wound down, Margaret walked the monastery grounds one final time. The gardens lay quiet under November stars, frost already touching the empty vegetable plots. The stone walls stood solid and eternal, holding within them 15 years of transformation and a century of memory before that. She ended, as she often did, in the preserved catacomb chamber. Father Benedict's portrait watched her with that unchanging expression, stern and uncompromising and somehow approving in its silence. We made it 15 years, Margaret said quietly. Emma's grown into someone extraordinary. The monastery's alive in ways you couldn't have imagined. We've helped thousands of families find their footing. Your artifacts became exactly what you wanted. Not treasure locked away, but transformation that spreads outward like ripples on water. She paused, choosing her final words carefully. I used to come here seeking your approval. Trying to prove I was worthy of what you left behind. But I understand now that worthiness isn't something you inherit or discover. It's something you build, one choice at a time, one family helped, one life changed. You didn't choose me because I was worthy. You created a system that would test whoever came, and I passed that test by choosing service over selfishness. Margaret reached out, touching the frame of Benedict's portrait with gentle reverence. Thank you for trusting the future. For believing someone would come who understood what you built. For having the courage to defy authority when authority lost its way. You saved my daughter's life and gave purpose to mine. That legacy continues every day in every family we help, every student we train, every person who finds dignity again in walls you built 178 years ago. She turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway for one last look back. The land remembers, she said. Everything that happened here. Your prayers and protection. Our desperation and discovery. All the families who found shelter in your vision. The land holds all of it, and it will hold whatever comes next. That's what legacy means. Not preserving your name, but creating something that outlasts you and serves purposes you couldn't imagine. Margaret climbed the stairs from the catacombs, emerging into the monastery's main hall where a few people still lingered, cleaning up from the celebration. Emma was laughing with students, making plans for an expansion to the technical institute that would add advanced manufacturing training. Father Michael was deep in conversation with Sister Anne, who'd driven from Pittsburgh for the anniversary, both of them discussing the new community center opening in the spring. The monastery hummed with life and purpose, every corner holding stories of transformation and second chances. The building breathed with the rhythm of human occupation, no longer abandoned but claimed, no longer silent but filled with the sounds of community and hope. Margaret stood in the entrance hall where she'd first entered 15 years ago, frightened and desperate and completely unprepared for what she'd found. The scared woman who'd signed those inheritance papers barely resembled the person she'd become. Margaret had learned that poverty wasn't permanent, that desperation could lead to purpose, that hidden wealth meant nothing compared to visible good. The Pennsylvania mountains settled into winter darkness, early snow beginning to fall in soft flakes that caught the light streaming from the monastery's windows. Inside, people continued their celebrations and conversations, building connections that would outlast the evening. Outside, the land held its eternal witness. Patient and enduring as it had always been. Remembering Father Benedict's first stones laid in mountain soil. Remembering decades of monastic prayer and routine. Remembering abandonment and decay. Remembering Margaret and Emma's arrival, desperate and hoping. Remembering discovery, transformation, and resurrection. The monastery stood against the winter night, no longer a monument to institutional failure but a testament to what happens when people honor the past while building toward the future. Father Benedict's name lived on, not through church records or historical plaques, but through the living community that had grown from his hidden wealth and Margaret's impossible choices. The land remembered everything. And now it had something worth remembering. A legacy that would continue long after the last person who knew Father Benedict's story had passed. Long after Margaret and Emma themselves became memory. The work would continue because that's what real legacy meant. Not endings, but continuations. Not conclusions, but new beginnings built on old foundations. Margaret rejoined the gathering, carrying with her 15 years of lessons learned, a dead monk's blessing across time, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that sometimes desperate inheritance leads to purpose that echoes across generations. The monastery's lights glowed warm against the winter darkness, a beacon of hope on mountain slopes that had witnessed so much human struggle and triumph. Inside those walls, built by faith and preserved by courage, the work continued. Families finding shelter. Students learning skills. Communities forming from isolation and need. Father Benedict's vision, hidden for a century and discovered by accident, had finally found the inheritors it was waiting for. Not through blood or authority, but through the simple willingness to honor what mattered most. And in that honoring, in that daily choice to serve rather than possess, legacy became eternal. The snow fell softly on old stone and new gardens alike, covering everything with winter's temporary peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families needing help, new opportunities to transform wealth into dignity. But tonight, the monastery rested in the satisfaction of work well done and purpose faithfully kept. The land held all of it. Every prayer, every secret, every transformation. Holding it the way only land can, with patience and permanence, waiting to see what stories the future would bring. And somewhere in the eternal silence of stone and soil and time, Father Benedict Thorn's stubborn spirit finally rested, knowing his faith in the future had been justified, his defiance of authority vindicated, his protection of sacred purpose honored by strangers who proved worthier than blood. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.